All good? Well, I just want to thank you on behalf of WSMA and everyone who, asked that we have this event. Thank you so much for being here and being able to share your insight on this topic. I think, a lot of people are trying to navigate how they're having conversations with their administrators, and I think it's helpful to hear different perspectives about what's working for you all as we navigate this. So you four don't necessarily all know each other, correct? Like
Right.
you're meeting each other for the first time today, right?
A couple of us might know each other just a little bit.
Just a little?
Just a little. Yourselves formally. We don't have anyone else in here yet, so.
I missed a little bit of what you said, Laurie. I didn't know if you were wanting us to chime in or not.
Oh, I was saying if you'd like to introduce yourselves to each other, there's no one else in the meeting yet, so feel free to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to kind of take a stab at it. For those of you, I think really, Jennifer and Holly, who I've not met, it is nice to meet you. And anytime we get to do these things, I think is fantastic. You read these bios, but ultimately, I'm in my first year here as superintendent for the Burlington area schools. I was a high school principal for 20 years, something like that. And prior to that, I was a band director. I had the good fortune, when I laugh and I see Ben, to work with his father in my last band director job as colleagues, and Ben was a student at the time. So that was it's pretty wild to be sitting here and seeing how these relationships cycle over the years. So it's really pretty cool.
I can certainly echo those sentiments, Steve. I mean, it's just great to kind of come full circle on the whole thing where, you're always a student, but it's always nice to be in the position of having something to share with others. And I think that's kind of where I'm at right now is I have the benefit of so many great teachers, and Steve being one of them. Hopefully you aren't blushing too much, Steve, but it's just so humbling to be a part of something so much bigger than just yourself. And I think it's great to be a part of this panel. Just hopefully we have something that we can share that people can take away from the experience feeling better about. Now I see a couple of other participants too. I mean, I had a chance to meet Holly. I think we were working on something back in January before all this craziness started happening. I think we were at the annual meeting, if that's not mistaken.
Yes, we were.
Yes, okay. And I'm sure a lot.
We are going to go ahead and get started with our Wisconsin Education Forum this afternoon. My name is Laurie Fellenz, and I'm the Executive Director of WSMA, as well as the Wisconsin Music Educators Association and the Foundation. On behalf of WSMA, I'd like to welcome you today to our second Wisconsin Education Forum. We also want to welcome you who are attending our WSMA member school educators, WMEA members, and other music and arts education stakeholders to this forum. It's being recorded, and we plan to make this recording available on our WSMA YouTube channel in the next 24 hours. So during this 90-minute event, we'd like for you to sit back and learn more from 4 Wisconsin school district administrators about how they are approaching their fall 2020 planning and what suggestions they will offer us today about effective communications between educators and administrators when discussing complex topics. So with that, it is my honor to introduce you today to your 4 panelists. First, we have Holly. Holly currently serves as the Assistant Superintendent in Kimberly. She began her career as a music educator in Luxembourg-Casco, and she currently serves as the chair of the Advocacy Committee for WASCD, and she's also our administrative representative on the WMEA Council. Holly and her husband are still very passionate vocal and theatrical performers. And anything you'd like to add, Holly?
No, that's it. Thanks for including me.
We're happy to have you here. Our next panelist is Steve Plank. He is the superintendent of schools in Burlington and has 20 years experience in school administration, including fine arts administrator of Adelaide Stevenson High School in Lincolnshire, Illinois, which, Steve, by the way, I've actually toured. What a phenomenal place. Prior to his work in school administration, he also was an instrumental music educator. Earned his doctorate in administration and supervision from Loyola, and his dissertation, really timely actually, Perceptions of Value and Perceived Strengths of Arts Education During an Age of Accountability, Conditions and Qualities that Shape a Citizenry. So Steve currently also serves on boards connected with our organizations. He's on the WSMA and WFSM boards. So welcome, Steve. Anything you'd like to add?
No, thank you, Laurie. Just again, happy to be here. Appreciate the opportunity.
Welcome. Our third guest is Jennifer Rouscher. She just made a shift from Plymouth to becoming the new Director of Secondary Education for the Wausau School District. So again, having previously served as principal of the Plymouth Comprehensive High School and also working in DC Everest and Pulaski. So she has earned her PhD in curriculum instruction from Marian University, and again is a board member for WSMA and WFSM. And I can attest this is an ardent supporter of music education and the arts. Welcome, Jennifer. Anything you'd like to add?
Thank you, Laurie. No, it's a great intro. And like the others, I'm just very happy to be here.
And last but most certainly not least, we have Ben Heninger, who is currently the 612 principal in Gresham, has been a school district administrator and instrumental music educator in Wisconsin public schools for over 14 years. Ben's dissertation, Instrumental Music Study and Student Achievement, has been cited numerous times in music education and academic publications. And that was a key part of the spring of 2019 when Ben was invited to provide testimony to the Wisconsin legislature in support of the bipartisan bill that eventually became Wisconsin 2019 Act 85. He currently serves on the National Band Association Wisconsin Chapter Board of Directors. Welcome, Ben. Anything you'd like to add?
Thank you, Laurie. No, very, very grateful to serve as a school administrator during these very tumultuous times, and thanks to everybody else for sharing in the conversation.
Yeah, it's tumultuous times indeed, and your service, all four of you in education during this complex time, is most certainly appreciated by everyone. I want to take just a moment before we jump into our first question and just describe the format of the forum for our attendees. So today, all four of the panelists are going to be presented with the same two questions, plus a warm-up question we're going to do here in a moment. Following the response to these two questions where they all will respond, we're actually going to open up two questions in the Q&A. So be thinking about questions you might have as attendees, because when we get to the second part of this, you will be able to pose questions to our panelists. If there's questions that we're not able to get to, we will save the chat and we will actually work out how we will share information to all registrants following the event. So all your questions are very important. The ones we get to in the event, we will take care of here, and we will find ways to share answers to the others. So let's get right into it, panelists, with this warm-up question. So if there were a top 40 hit song written about your experience with this spring 2020 semester through your role as an administrator in Wisconsin, what would the title of that song be? And I'll let you share, and whoever wants to go first, just jump right in.
Well, I asked my husband what his answer would be, and he said, "Take this job and shove it." And I said, well, that wasn't how I felt. So my song would be very different. My song, I actually picked "Every Little Thing's Gonna Be All Right" by Bob Marley. I felt like my job was to find the calm in the storm and make sure everybody had what they needed and that they knew we were going to get through this if we did it together. So that was my song.
It's a great segue. I'll take that from Holly's lead. I too decided to ask some colleagues. It wasn't a spouse, but some colleagues about what their song would be, and it became a tough choice because things like Poison's "Nothing But a Good Time" ended up taking a back seat to "I Will Survive" by Gloria Gaynor. The reality is, as Holly so eloquently said, we knew we were going to get through it. But they were challenging times for sure, and we did in fact survive and are here to prove it.
So kind of jumping off of where Steve just ended, I'm more of a pop 40 type person to describe it, kind of in a generational sense. But I think a lot of our students, especially our seniors, could definitely identify with "Hey Look Ma, I Made It" by Panic at the Disco. There's a lot of panic in the air throughout the second semester. I certainly tried not to reflect that, but we did make it to the end of the semester. And regardless of where things go next, I have nothing but the utmost confidence in our leaders around the state and the staff that we are working with in our own schools to start the next chapter in education.
Those are all really good titles. And I thought, well, what remakes would work? And I thought of Ozzy Osbourne's "Mama, I'm Coming Home." Because we all did go home, and Bachman Turner Overdrive's "You Ain't Seen Nothing Yet." But then I thought, oh, maybe I'm supposed to come up with an original song title. So that was more pressure. And I thought, well, if I had to come up with a positive original one, I think I would just call it "Step Up," because we've all been asked to step up, and we will continue to be. Our work is not done, but what a great place to be in terms of having the opportunity to be involved in something none of us have ever done before.
Well, those were even better than I'd imagined when I asked you that question, and really captured the breadth and depth of what we've been going through collectively and together in this situation. So now we're going to move into a meatier question, our first question of the day. Our forum attendees today come from varied perspectives with education. When I looked at the attendee list, I see we have teachers, we have parents, we have business owners, arts advocates, and others listening today. So they're interested to hear you share your perspective about how you're currently approaching your planning for fall 2020 in your district. So who are the stakeholders who've been involved? What are the resources you're using or wish existed actually? And what does this complex work look like from your perspective? And again, we would want all four of you to respond, but take you in any order you would like to go.
I feel like I should start because I'm at the top visually on my own. I don't know if everybody's at the top on their own, but so one of the things that we did right out of the gate is we knew we were going to have to understand where our community stood on, do you want to even come back to school? So we did a survey very early on in the summer, not to ask people to commit, but to understand how is the community feeling about their options in fall. So we started from that perspective, and at the same time, we brought teachers in small groups, which was so refreshing. We socially distanced, but to see each other in person and talk about what did those last 9 weeks really feel like, and what did we do well that we need to continue doing, and if we ever have to close for what we presume will be a shorter time moving forward, what do we need to do differently to improve that experience? Because we assume it won't look like the entire state is shut down again. It might be a building, it might be a classroom. So we first created those plans for short-term shutdowns. Then we moved into, okay, what does the online experience look like? Because we know we're gonna have people that don't want to come, and we still want them to be a part of our district. It's important that they feel like they are still a paper maker in our district in Kimberly. So we built that experience, and then at the same time talked about what does in-person look like so that it's safe enough for students and staff to return. So how do we mitigate that risk? And I would really say, so that I don't spend eons of time talking, what was most important is finding great leaders, whether those were teachers or paraprofessionals or administrators, and give them clear marching orders and let them go do good work. And we have so many active committees running right now to each take an individual task and figure this out. And our communication has become even tighter and stronger so that we can come back together and make sure it still looks like a district when we're done. So that's the approach we've taken.
Thank you, Holly, for that.
I didn't know if I should go next or not, because I don't want people to think that there's a rotation and it's linear. But hearing a pause, I will add, and I think that that is sort of the goal of panels, is that we take the opportunity to hear from our colleagues. I certainly will attempt to not duplicate anything that has already been said. When I look at this question, I get somewhat fixed on, what is the perspective about how we're planning? And one of the things that continues to sort of stay in my mind and keep me awake at night is that if our number one core business is education, and that really then also means that our core stakeholder is our kids and their families. And I think that can sometimes be hard for the adults that we serve and employ, because the reality is we're not in the business of employment, we're in the business of education. And so I certainly don't mean to be dismissive to all of our teacher colleagues. And yet, when listening to Holly, one of the things that certainly resonated is that our key stakeholders had to be our families and our kids. And so all of our surveys and data gathering were aimed at that stakeholder group, because we needed to understand what we did well during the closure that started on March 13th through the end of the year, so that we could learn from it, so that if and when, frankly, we have to revisit that virtual environment, it can be better than it once was. We also knew that we had to gain an understanding of where our community was at in terms of broadband internet access, in terms of the ability and the desire to get kids back in school, how it was affecting the social emotional well-being at home, and how it was impacting parents' ability to live and to work. And so one of the things when I think about perspective is, what is predictable for parents? What can we tell them that's going to offer them a certain amount of consistency so that they can plan in this very tumultuous and uncertain time? And how do we do so while balancing those needs, and particularly the needs of physical safety versus the emotional well-being that we keep hearing about relative to what kids are experiencing when they're not with us and in our buildings? So our stakeholders, predominantly our kids and our families, the predictability, the consistency, and the safety piece were our big drivers. And then lastly, I'll just say from a resource perspective, we need our decision makers in our legislature to be part of this conversation. I know that I've asked very directly for things about open enrollment to be stopped, so that what one school does doesn't necessarily bounce into another school. People are worried about families being upset with a plan locally and then moving somewhere else. People are worried about litigation and the lack of immunity that public ed has right now in this time of people getting sick and, heaven forbid, dying. So those are a couple of things from a resource perspective that I think are huge and just need to be considerations as we do this work.
And I guess I share a lot of the same feelings that Steve and Holly have already shared. I mean, the importance of connecting with all stakeholders, especially families and the children, focusing on social and emotional needs and learning, even in the absence of the infrastructure to support a lot of what we try to do every day. I mean, just in our northern section of the state, we still have almost fully a third of our students who do not have access to the internet. And it may sound absurd to those who live in other areas of the state, but there are such deep inequities that exist within the state of Wisconsin that have not been systemically addressed yet. And I think we're really trying to do our very best, regardless of where we are, to address those. I mean, it's going to take an entirely different way of solving this challenge. I mean, it's going to be a paradigm shift, and where it gets difficult is we have such great people supporting what we are doing, but the uncertainty of everything that's going on has upended all the norms that we have come to expect as education professionals. And I know we'll get through it together, but just the uncertainty of everything changing on a moment's notice, we can come up with plans. We're such good innovators in education. And with collaborating stakeholders of small businesses, community, we're doing all of those things because that's a part of what we do in allocating resources for our staff and our students. But the uncertainty is what is driving so much of the anxiety that a lot of us, especially in leadership, are feeling right now. And believe me, that is shared among all of us, and we will get through it together. I keep saying it, but I do believe it. We will get through it together, and we'll find new and innovative ways to reach all of our staff and our students.
Thank you, Ben. Jennifer?
Yes, I would echo a lot of the things that have been said in terms of who the stakeholders are, and certainly using a variety of different ways to find, to stay connected, even though we're still distanced, and whether that's connecting with students and families or connecting as staff to do some of this work. It's definitely complex. And I think one of the things that's been especially challenging that many people will relate to is at the very time that a lot of educators were ready to step back and try to take a break and maybe tend to their own wellness or spend a little time with family, we haven't done that in the way we normally would in the summer. The pandemic and the planning has just sort of kept everybody going, everybody thinking. So that's a challenge. I've described our planning as planning to be flexible, which seems opposite, but I think that's really just an honest approach, and that makes it challenging because a lot of our stakeholders would like to, they'd like to have concrete answers. They'd like to know, are we starting school for sure in September or not? You know, if we do, what does it look like? If we don't, what will we do instead? And as you said, Ben, it's so uncertain that I think the best we can do is plan to be flexible and keep talking with each other, keep communicating. Yeah, I think that's probably the biggest challenge out there, is to remain flexible and then to stay focused on teaching and learning. I've also talked with a lot of others who've said, oh, you know, we were making such great progress on our strategic plan, and then that sort of went on hold, or, oh, we were working towards this initiative, and boy, now we haven't talked about equity in 2 months, or whatever it might be. So I think that's another thing we're trying to bring back to our planning here in Wausau, is to look at kind of what are those big rocks for us, the things we want to focus our time and attention on, and how do we keep those part of the planning conversation, even though we're not anywhere near where we were, say, last October.
Before we go on to our next big question, if I could just ask a follow-up, based on language Jennifer just used, that planning to be flexible. I was wondering if you all can think of an example of some area where you're planning to be flexible. In other words, there's a more detailed plan, but the plan itself is centered around flexibility. Are there thoughts on that?
Right out of the gate, I can tell you that professional development is an area where we are planning to be flexible. We know that subs are going to be at a premium, and we may not have them available when people want to do learning, whether that's learning online or working together as a group. And so we are planning on the day before trying to say, okay, we have subs for tomorrow, so you can get together as a group.
Great example. Other thoughts on that?
I was just going to add that I think, you know, the media is covering all schools right now, and you continue to hear repeatedly people have a virtual plan, they have an in-person plan, they have some sort of a hybrid plan. The reality is we're probably going to loop in and out of all three of those instructional models over the course of the next 6, 12, 18 months. And so the notion of staying adaptable and being flexible and just kind of smiling in the heat of the frustration can really go a long way to calm kids, parents, community members. And I think as a profession, we have a grand opportunity right now to show policymakers, like, we're all in. We are going to continue to figure this out, because we don't always garner the best reputation at the level of decision-making that happens in Madison politically. And so I do think that we do have a fantastic opportunity to remain flexible, and it can be all kinds of things. We could talk about transportation and the fact that if we want older siblings to potentially help their younger siblings get to school, somebody's going to be quote unquote tardy. Frankly, who cares, right? I mean, that becomes the reality. We could talk about lunch. and the disruption that having 4 or 5 lunches in the school might cause. Or we could say it's a win because kids are there. We could say, you know, maybe the art educator has to have a little bit less time with kids because the art educator is going to need more time to clean some of the supplies that get shared. But at least we're having art. So I think when it comes to flexibility, we could come up with, you know, an ongoing running list of what those might be. But hopefully those are just a couple of added concrete examples.
I love that point, Steve, and you make it so well. I believe that flexibility and innovation go hand in hand. And if we have the resources available for our teachers, regardless of what format we're locked into on a moment's notice, we're going to still have great things happening with our kids. It's critical, though, to tell the story. I mean, that's part of our job as a school administrator, is to share the great work that's being done in our schools. But it doesn't have to be relegated to just us. We can have, you know, our teachers sharing stories. You know, social media is such a powerful tool when it's used correctly, of course. But, you know, we're leaders, not lobbyists. And I think that's a really fine nexus when you start to look at telling the story of what's going on in our schools, especially since this whole thing started. And I always struggle with those who make the argument, well, schools have been closed since March. No, they have not. They have simply redefined what education looks like. And I think we're going to tell that story even more effectively as we move forward in this new environment.
Thank you, Ben. Any other thoughts before we move on to our next big question? All righty. Well, the next question we wanted to ask was related to communication. So superintendents and principals across Wisconsin are currently, as you've described, involved in complex decision-making with their school-based teams, their families, their students. We're also hearing from educators that they have ideas they want to share with their administrators, or they may have questions about a decision they believe has already been made. So in your experience, what approaches and strategies do you most appreciate when an educator needs to share their feedback and ideas? And conversely, is there any approach that's actually counterproductive? And if so, what might you recommend instead? And if you're comfortable with it, we can go in the reverse order that we just did the last question and begin with Jennifer and work our way back to Holly, if that works.
Sure. I made a list. I was trying to think of all the possibilities, but I'll just give a few. And I think to keep going with that idea of flexibility, one of the things I wrote down was be a flexible helper, not a diva. And I thought that might connect with the music audience, that language, but really I think it's thinking about partly what are the core things that are so important to us about music education first. You know, it's that know yourself and what gets you excited and why do you do these things with kids every day. But then thinking about how can you use that to partner flexibly with other things. So, you know, maybe thinking about, okay, how does music education relate to some of the other things in your strategic plan? Does music education connect to literacy and help that move forward? Does it relate to equity? Does it relate to social emotional learning? And we would all say, well, of course. So, you know, if those are big things in your district, come at it from that angle. I think partnerships are going to be so important as we try to figure out different schedules and kids in different places. You know, how can music coordinate well with Phy-Ed or with health or with social studies, or, you know, what are ways that we can work together flexibly? And it won't look exactly the same as it always has. I think we know that, but there are components that can be there. Another piece of that flexibility, I guess, is coming in with some ideas, some solutions. You know, instead of coming in and saying, well, we can't do this way, or we, you know, oh, we have to have this. And well, you know, what if we looked at changing the sequence of our instruction within a year? If we don't know what it's going to look like in a fall, could we start with some of the music learning that's more easily adaptable to being virtual or to being part-time, and then hoping, you know, that at another point we could do some of the things that it's more critical to be face-to-face, or So I think bringing in the ideas and being willing to present yourself as part of the team is a great way to start.
I really appreciate the way Jennifer says that, because, you know, when you talk about disciplinary literacy, it is not an all or nothing type approach. I mean, it's like, you don't have to think about standards as, you know, relegated to a particular content area. Like, you can't be teaching social studies and music. I mean, we have to really disconnect from that paradigm where, you know, the content area expert is the source of all information. I really, I don't know if you're trying to say that, Jennifer, but that really resonates with me, how we have to be innovative in finding new ways to explore the content area, whether it's in small groups, the cohorts. I mean, we have the challenge at our school of, we are one of the smallest pre-K through 12 districts in the state. So we're tackling one of those issues where, do we have enough staff to pull this off in the event that we have to suddenly change course? But throughout the whole process, being transparent, having an open door policy between your administrators and the staff, and even the school board, because they are all such an integral part of every decision that has to be made, and it will have to be made at some point. I think the committees that are doing the work really deserve the lion's share of the credit for coming up with these great ideas, because at the end of the day, we have to sign off at the upper levels. I use the word upper levels, but we do have to make a decision, and we have to make sure that our board, all the way down to our, through our support staff and our parents and our students, are supportive of the things that we're proposing. And it may change from district to district. So I think the open door policy, having that understanding that, you know, not one person is going to have all the answers. I think that's a difficult scenario for some people, and for some, you know, people who like to know the answers. But I think this, more than anything else, has really shared the importance of disciplinary literacy in all areas of the curriculum. And just being willing to collaborate, being willing to come together as a staff, as a board, as an administrative team to make these important decisions is going to be so critical to moving forward in a meaningful way.
Thank you, Ben.
Yeah, for me, I think in some ways, this question is the linchpin of the conversation. It's where it happens. And I read this question a bit literally, so Laurie might have to rein me in a little bit on this one. But I really focus on the various parts of the question that, you know, educators have ideas that they want to share, no doubt. I think the debate, if you will, comes with how best to do that. And, you know, I think around, you know, this idea that decisions have been made, you know, therefore what do I do? And I think the first caution that I might offer is to, you know, kind of a two-parter. Seek first to understand. We've all heard that before. And maybe ask for clarity about, was this a discussion, or has there in fact been a decision that's been made? And I think you would find that for a lot of administrators, we really work hard to offer that information up front so you don't have to ask. But that's not always the case. And sometimes what I find is that people will come at me, so to speak, as though, oh no, a decision's been made, so therefore it is the end all be all, it's been written in stone, forget about it. And while that might have been true at some points in our careers, it's certainly not true today. Because something that we might think a decision's been made on today is going to look different 4 days from now, because the Department of Ed at the federal level decides to go on the TV and start saying a bunch of things that we didn't know were coming. So clarity around, has it actually been a decision, or was it just a discussion? And then to think a little bit about, when you have ideas, to maybe come at it through an inquiry-based mindset first, and ask the question, or make the comment, I'm here to first seek to understand, and not to be flippant about it. It doesn't have to sound manufactured, but I do think that there's a way to do that. And when there's somebody that needs to share, I know that I appreciate the mindset of, hey, Steve, can you help me understand why? Again, I would hope that as a colleague that I'm doing my very best to always offer upfront the why a decision has to be made, perhaps what went into that decision, so that people don't have to wonder or ask. And at the same time, I recognize that many of these complex decisions are very, very messy, and they involve some stakeholders, and then others might not have had a seat at the table, so they don't have the same background or the same level of information. And so then I turn to, it relies upon our relationship. It's the communication that we've had with one another. It's the ability for both the teacher and the administrator to balance whatever might be the program needs. In this case, it would be the music program against the vision or the strategic plan of the district. And how do we talk about the alignment of those energies as opposed to potential barriers that might exist? And I also recognize that sometimes people are feeling pretty overwhelmed, or that there are other emotions at play like there are right now. You know, as we are talking about the return to school buildings, not back to school. We've never stopped being in school. The learning has continued. But people are frustrated, they're overwhelmed, and frankly, they're scared. And so there's an emotion there that we need to take the time to listen to and be partnering with people to address. And so when I think about the relationships, I turn a little bit to, you know, what's obvious, what's common sense. You know, for most administrators, if you're attached to a building, you know that first car that's in that parking lot's probably the band director. You know, if I'm the band director, I might specifically pull up right next to where I know the administrator parks so that she or he sees me, you know, because some of that is just the nature of this sort of game that we all play in terms of the way that people, you know, behave, what is human behavior. And I think, interestingly enough, I think Jennifer commented to this earlier, this idea of kind of the rock stars and the whiners, right? Like people, I think you said diva, to be fair, Jennifer. But, you know, people really do right now, they're watching us. Parents are watching us, politicians are watching us. And if we need to vent, we need to find a forum to do that that's relatively private. It doesn't do us a lot of good when we do that out in a political arena, or particularly a social media arena that quickly becomes political. We see what the end result of that typically is. So I would say when you have something that you want to communicate with your administrator, think about, I'm not going to be high maintenance. I don't want there to be surprises for the administrator. And I want it to be somewhat symbolic in the sense that as an artist, I want to communicate that what we do is important, it's valuable, and that we're part of that bigger team, the theme of what goes on in a school. And so particularly right now, as we face the fall of 2020, it might be that a music teacher might approach an administrator and say, hey, not really sure what band's going to look like right out of the gate, but I'm here, whatever you need. And that goes so far in developing that relationship. So I'll just kind of stop there, you know, with the suggestion of that olive branch, because I know there's other questions and we got to get to Holly's comments as well.
Hey, Steve, just a moment of levity for you. So what do I do if the band director happens to be the administrator? Just kidding, just kidding.
You get a mirror, Ben.
I don't know if that's carpooling or. So I was going to say many of the things that Steve said, and as he said in the beginning, I'm not going to repeat those, but social media, I will pick up that thread for a moment because I think people have seen what's going around now with, here are all the questions I have before we return to school. And I can appreciate that, but what people need to know is there are hundreds of people working on those answers right now. And the perception is that we aren't thinking about it, but the reality is that we are thinking about it every day. It keeps us awake at night, and we are trying to figure out the best, safest way for teachers to be able to come back and students to be able to come back. And I agree, teachers are ambassadors, and what you say matters, and people are watching, and people from all sides of political spectrums are watching, and making enemies in this moment is not a smart thing to do. So to that social media, when you talk about what's a counterproductive approach, I think that's very counterproductive to what we're trying to accomplish here. And I will just echo what's been said about be flexible, be creative. When you present solutions, thinking outside the box and saying, hey, if we shared this space, or if we moved our room down to here, or if we only did ensemble work versus doing large group, and bringing forward some of those things, because I think every educator, regardless of what they teach, starts at how can I make it look like it's always looked, and then fit all this other social distancing and risk mitigation on top of it. And you have to start exactly the opposite and go with, how do we socially distance? How do we socially group? How do we risk mitigate? And then change what we do to fit that, because this is a weird and different year. And so when you're presenting ideas, that creativity is so valuable. The other thing is, and Steve did say this, but I agree, find out what conversations that have happened, because in larger districts like ours in Kimberly, you know, we're not in Milwaukee, but we have 500 people working here, and I can't field questions nor give answers to 500 people. So right size where you have your entry point for your comment or finding out your information, because sometimes it's your colleagues, sometimes it's your principal, and get it to somewhere to start finding out what conversations have happened here. And to the point of a decision that's been made, shoot, you know how many decisions I've made that the next day it's a different decision? So it doesn't matter when your idea comes in, because it might be wrong today and it might be right tomorrow. So it's okay to have those conversations and float everything, because flexibility is the name of the game as we move forward here. So that would be what I have to add to the conversation.
You all have given us so many great strategies, but when I kind of listened to the thread through them, I was really hearing this idea of, and I think Steve, you said it, you have to come with that inquiring mind, not kind of come barreling in with your own first thought, and find out all the pieces of information, maybe before you even bring forth a statement or ideas. Make sure you truly understand, you know, the context and what's happening. But Holly, conversely, things are moving so fast. You could do that on a Monday, and by Tuesday, it might be a completely different story. So it seems it's sort of a continual loop, if you will, of inquiry, problem solving, but flexibility and being a team player. Does that sound like what you were hearing? And that social media, as much as it allows us to reach a lot of people quickly, is also interfering with the messaging, if you will, that we maybe as a collective in Wisconsin in education want to have out there. I know one of the things I hear about often, because I'm on national calls with other states, is how they're behaving. But in Wisconsin, we do have local control. We are a local control state, and that works really well for a majority of things. Right now, people are looking for state level guidance. I was just wondering if you could speak to this idea of, so with the Education Forward Plan, which was our state guidance document, but still all the decisions being made at the local level. Are there things in that guidance document you are drawing from or have been really helpful in how you're approaching things? So the information DPI put out, what from that Education Forward has been helpful to you?
I'm happy to jump in, I suppose. And I guess I'll be brief about it. I think the greatest help was that it was affirming the on the ground conversations. Mm-hmm. I don't know, to be honest, and this is not meant in any negative way. I think that to some reality for most people, there were no surprises in that 87 pages of information. Mm-hmm. Now, on the one hand, we could celebrate that and say, that's wonderful that there were no balls coming out of left field. We could predict what was going on. Lots of communication from our state organizations all across the board. Superintendents, administrators, teachers, everybody has been working tirelessly on planning, thinking, asking questions, proposing what needs to be worked out. So the document was affirming for sure. I don't know if there were any ahas that came along with it, given the fact that there were some other states that had come out with pretty comprehensive plans in just the 2 to 4 weeks prior to the release from DPI. I will say that on the one hand, while we all do love local control, there's a little bit of being careful what you wish for. And now you've got, the tension between, school district A, B, and C, who are all walkable for a kid, depending on where you're situated, and open enrollment and stress for parents and different plans based on different needs in communities. And so I do feel like we're now left with us, county health, the now fiery debate around masks. Do you require them? Do you not? How does staff feel about that? How does it impact kids in their learning? There's so many questions, and I think a lot of people believe that some decision like that should be made at a much broader, higher level, even if it's regionally or by CISA or by part of the state or something, since there are different areas and kind of case loads, if you will. But I think that there's a balancing act there. I'm not sure we've necessarily found it, but it's what we have, and I think folks are going to continue to do the very best they can.
To your point, Steve, I couldn't agree more. And I would just further add to that, the best practice in the field of education doesn't change overnight, if at all sometimes. And with the backdrop of the global pandemic, we're suddenly faced with the challenge of trying to implement things that we know work, but for one reason or another, just simply can't right now. I mean, I would love to get back in front of kids and do a full band rehearsal, but the guidance that we're receiving from a local level might preclude that for a while. And so I think just being open and honest about what we can do within the limitations of what's best and accepted practices is part of the conversation and part of what we should be bringing to our discussions with other stakeholders, especially the teachers. And just one more quick thing on that point is it might change overnight. And as long as we keep the best interests of the students front and center, I don't think we won't do any wrong.
I will say that related to that, but different, the research coming out from the national music organizations has been exceptionally helpful, has given very good guidance, and we have referenced those almost on a daily basis. And I know new comes out all the time, but that has been very, very helpful.
I would agree, Holly, and I think that's a spot, and teachers will have to make this decision kind of based on the size of their district and which administrators they're talking to, how their systems work. But I think a lot of times administrators may not be able to look out at all of those different resources. So most of your principals are probably really familiar with Wisconsin's guidelines. That's where we live and breathe. But they may not know that, oh, there's information that's been put out about by the National Association of Choral Directors, or that NAFME has information, or that there's a study coming out very soon that WSMA helped to sponsor. So I think that's a spot where our music educators can very respectfully be helpful. Hey, I know you're looking at these big picture things. Here's something I found that's unique to music ed. Or these 3 things are out there. I've looked at them a lot. Can I give you a brief summary of what I'm seeing that's common? I don't want people to leave today feeling that they're not supposed to advocate for music. We want you to. We want you to advocate for kids and for music ed and all the things that we know wonderful about it. It's just about how can you do that in that helpful, respectful way. I think you're muted, Laurie.
Thank you, sorry. When someone in your district comes across that research and you are getting inundated with research from all the content areas and how do you, just personally, like in 30 seconds or less, how do you best like to receive that information? What are great ways to get that to you?
I might be very different because I have a regular phone conversation with the chairs of the music committee. And, but what I always ask in a nutshell is, what in this research is earth-shattering? I need to know what's different from the last time. So that's very helpful.
Yeah, and I would say for me, Laurie, one of the things I really do appreciate, no matter the subject, is if somebody can take a 15-page document that they've poured over for probably hours or days and just give me a couple, 3 bullets, like what are the highlights? And you know, it might be something that we're already doing, so it's affirming. It might be something we're not doing and we should be, but a little bit of a summary can just go a long way. It can help to understand how much time should be spent with the document.
Something that we haven't talked a lot about yet, in spite of all of our best intentions, we have been very quick to run things past legal counsel, because along with every decision, there is a possible negative consequence. And so making sure that we're doing something that's not only a good idea, but something that's legal and ethical. Those are some of the things that we have to think about too, from a leadership standpoint. So even if you have a great idea, which I encourage you to not pitch, but do have those conversations with your leadership, whether it's your administration or other teacher leaders. But just remember that there are implications for every decision that might have legal repercussions later on.
Thank you for that insight. Because I think a big part of this is just what are all the ways that we can best communicate with each other, all these complex ideas. And you four have shared quite a bit on this question. I think that will really help people think about maybe strategies that you reaffirmed they're already using, and then maybe ones that they could consider as a new strategy. So now we'd like to actually open this up to forum participant questions. At this point, attendees, there is a Q&A as part of your screen where you can ask a question. We already have one, so I'm going to go ahead and start with that one. But if you have other questions, if you put them into the Q&A section, I would appreciate that. We'll get through as many as we are able. And then if there's ones that we aren't, we'll figure out a way to get you responses to them. So this question comes from Mike. He's asking, can you please address how you're currently handling ensembles and lessons? So a very music specific question. Are students going to be able to play and sing? Will the size of those ensembles change? And if you do pull out lessons, will they be in a cohort group? So just the idea of right now, how are you looking at ensembles and lessons for students?
Even though I'm an assistant superintendent, I do right now coordinate all of the music groups and have met frequently with all of the people leading those groups. So I have lots of information on this actually. I'll try and give you the very short answers. Ensembles and lessons, we are first starting with ensembles from a change in the kinds of music that are being played, so that we're doing more chamber music, so that we can socially distance in our classes, because that is our first and primary goal, is to keep people as far apart as possible within the music classes, because that's the safest thing. And so we felt the way to hold them is to do smaller performing groups, both in choir and in band. We are doing lessons, and we have plexiglass on order that we can separate the teacher from the student. We are doing individual lessons. We are not doing group lessons. I know some places do. Where we do pull out in small groups though, we are keeping students as much in cohorts as absolutely possible, and we are doing assigned seating within the music classes. So we are stopping January 15th. Everything is getting revisited, and we will look at changing things as we're able to with the health conditions. Formal stopping January 15th, but we'll study and adjust all the way along.
Yeah, as it stands today, well, first I have to say hello to Mike. It's been a long time. Kind of, how you doing, brother? And then also for Burlington, we, in fact, our desire is to not treat music any differently than any of the other content areas. And I really feel strongly that it's imperative that I say that, so that people can understand that, look, when we have these wonderful things that happen in our world, we celebrate them together. When we have to retreat back and do things very differently, we all do that together. And so I wouldn't want for anyone to feel like music was going to be treated differently than any of our other subject areas. So that's paramount to our thinking. And then much of what Holly said for Kimberly is true for Burlington. And one thing I will add that is a thought for us is that to manage the choral world, we're probably going to have choir be in a different space and a much larger space so that they can in fact spread out. And we want for our kids to be able to sing, which means there's probably going to be some sort of specialized facial covering so that kids can sing. Clearly understand that has an effect to the sound quality, and yet if it's visible or see-through or whatever that might be, it still allows us to hold choir. So we fully anticipate that we are having band and choir. I don't have the level of detail about what we may end up doing with our lessons yet, but I would imagine that we will be able to navigate that as we will with any other small group instruction that goes on in our buildings.
I think the intent of a lot of what we do from an administrative level is to share information, not to share fear. I think a lot of this is going to be dependent upon the information that we get from the CDC. We had the advantage of having regular meetings with our health department, and they guide a lot of our decisions that will be made to determine what our band, what our choir, what our general music classes will look like. We are also, and I smile when I say this, we're also right in the middle of a building construction project. So that adds another layer of challenge to the decisions that we have to make regarding, can we have classes outside? Can we have classes when we're physically distanced at a level that is appropriate for the CDC? Do we have the necessary ventilation? Do we have the necessary separation? Things like that nature guide our decisions, and that may change on a daily basis. For example, today, the county where our school is located in, Shawano County, went from a medium risk to a high risk. And we have to be prepared for the fact that these things may change on a daily or weekly basis, especially when it comes to singing and playing. So we're obviously going to use the guidance that we have from the CDC and from our professional organizations before we make a decision that could impact what these classes look like.
The good news is the questions are starting to roll in. So we've got several in the queue. The next one's going to be around technology. Are you aware currently of solutions in your district or in your geographic area, the state, where there's solutions to internet inequities on the horizon? So if you could speak to internet inequities as well as just technology inequities in general.
So that was one of the things that precluded us from going entirely online in the spring when this whole thing started, was a third of our families did not have reliable access to the internet. I encourage everybody who has equity of access issues to contact their elected representatives and really talk about the E-rate program and how fully funding the E-rate program can really give you a leg up on getting the digital access that our students and our families require to have a high level of instruction during those times when we can't necessarily meet face-to-face due to restrictions that have been brought about by the pandemic. So I'd say contact your representatives, talk about E-rate, and there are grants out there that are available, but I think there is enough systemic inequity where this needs to be addressed on a state and a federal level.
Other thoughts on technology and internet in any of your other communities?
I would just add that to reinforce what Ben said about the fact that this is a legislative topic at either the state or national level, because the variance across our state is so incredible that it's almost hard to wrap your mind around. As we really narrowed down this question in the spring with our families, here in the Burlington area, we're at 97% of our families have access to broadband internet. And so the 3% who don't, when we drill that down and ask, well, how are you getting online? Then they have cell phones, data plans, other ways, or maybe it's a slower version of the internet. But then when we take that all the way down to who really doesn't have access and might need a hotspot, we're at like 24 families, which we can manage. And that's out of, 3,500 kids. So it's just a very, very different world, which I think really kind of echoes the comments that this is it's a bigger issue than at the local level.
Fantastic. Unless there's something very different from Holly or Jennifer, I'm going to move on to another question. All right. So there's a question about your initial plan. So earlier in our conversation today, there were hints at the flexibility and we might be in all three plans at once. So this question's asking, does your school district actually have an initial plan A for September? Do you know how you're going in the door at the beginning of September? Is it full, face-to-face, hybrid, or online only? And then secondly, part B of this question, have you identified a threshold or data point where a shift to a different instructional model would be initiated? And this question's coming from Brad.
And I'll start, and I'll try to be kind of quick. Again, first I want to say, how you doing, Brad? It's great to sort of see you, but not. I'd love to actually be able to talk. But having said that, for Burlington, because we actually are starting school August 17th, that is a result of a waiver that was approved all the way back in October because of a massive construction project we have going on. So we're probably among the first public schools that will start this school year in August. Our board just approved that the model that they would like us to begin with, or at least plan to begin with, is a hybrid. So all of our pre-K through 6th grade kids will be in person all day, every day, but we're spreading them out all over kind of our buildings up through and including our middle school, which allows us to run every one of those buildings at less than half capacity. At the secondary level then, grades 7 through 12, they will all operate out of our high school, which is big enough to accommodate them and then some, but they will come on an A-B rotation, half in person, half virtual. And so when I say it's a hybrid, for our youngest learners who really can't be at home, daycare is an issue, the virtual world is more difficult to navigate, they're gonna be with us all day, every day. And at the secondary level, where that's a little bit of a different world, that's going to be more of a hybrid virtual and in person. And the other element of that I think is huge is that our board is going to require all students and all staff to have some sort of face covering. And so that is a big deal. That was just decided on Monday night. And frankly, right before this started, WISN Channel 12 out of Milwaukee wanted to talk because we're among the first school districts that are actually laying out a pretty detailed plan because we start before everybody else. The second part of it, the threshold to shift, much of that isn't going to be something that we probably decide. It will probably be with our county health. And our county health here in Racine County has sort of a 4-point awareness system for a level of risk. We just yesterday started to touch, we're actually in the high risk now because of community spread that's happened probably since 4th of July weekend. That sustained high risk will drive us into a virtual environment if it continues. So between now and August 17th, if things continue on the pace that frankly they're on today, then our hybrid model is we're gonna have to adapt. And so I'm not sure that will necessarily be our decision, but that's gonna be what shifts us through those models.
Anyone else at the point yet where they're announcing a plan or close to knowing?
We are doing 2 options. We are in person or online, and parents will have the option to select. We have a survey that will be going out to ask parents to make their selection. And as for threshold, it's going to have to be reactionary. We're gonna have to look at that as it comes, but we'll be evaluating pretty much every single day on, is this working?
Yeah, we have not made a decision yet because technically we won't get to. Our school board will ultimately make that decision, so that they have not made a decision yet. We're still gathering information. But something that's been presented to think about in terms of criteria, we're in a situation where we don't have a lot of specific guidance from our county health department. We certainly partner with them, but there wasn't anything hard and fast. And we were struggling to figure out how we as a school district would keep track of, well, what is moderate spread versus a high spread, low spread. And so we thought, well, what are some of the things that we can pay attention to and are aware of as a school system? So some of the things that we're thinking about and proposing is one, to look at food scarcity or food availability. Do we have the ability to feed our students? Because that's really an important piece. And then we actually looked back a little bit to H1N1 times, I think around 2009. And there were some percentages out there based on, say, percentage of students who were absent or percentage of staff who were absent. So we're trying to look at things like that. And so, for example, one of the things is that, well, if we had fewer than 20% of our students and staff absent, we would be able to operate. Now, you know, whether that's fully safe health-wise, we're still trying to learn that. If we got to the point where we had 20% or more of our staff out, then we might have to move to a hybrid model just to be able to have, you know, you can't have students in a building if you don't have adults there to work with them and support them. And if we had 20% or more of our students absent, we would probably need to go completely virtual just to give time for everybody to recover and get back in a safer situation. So that's not decided for sure, but it's one of the things that we're looking at and we'll bring to the board for them to weigh in on.
I guess up here in northern Wisconsin, I mean, I've heard so many different plans that districts have, and it's really, I don't know, it's not a bad thing, but it definitely gives you the sense that we all do respond to the unique needs of our community within the parameters that the health department gives us. And I think that's the big thing. So to answer your question, Brad, we're currently planning on doing a hybrid or a blended model when we return in September. And that will have to ultimately be approved by our school board, which is going to happen, hopefully, fingers crossed, at our next monthly meeting. But we are prepared for the possibility of having to go to online instruction. And we see the face-to-face, regular, normal school day only happening after we have reached a level where there are no new cases for a sustained period of time. And that's kind of the benchmark that we've been told to expect throughout this pandemic.
Thank you, everybody, for providing that information about current state. And as you shared earlier, we could ask you a week from now and you might have a different answer. So continue to follow, how that goes as you make your decisions. So this next question is about general music classes. Music, and this comes from Christina. Music on a cart or pop-up music in a classroom versus music in a specialist room using video chat. What are your thoughts, and are there other options you're considering? So what will those elementary arts experiences look like at your schools?
I guess I'll jump in right away just because we had a meeting yesterday with our food service provider, which it sounds off topic, but let me get to it. Because we have the possibility of taking all the things that the kids need, whether it's nutrition or instruction, to the kids. We're looking very seriously at a cohort model at the lower grades, where we would have some form of art and music on a cart with the proper PPE provided for the instructor, social distancing, things of that nature. It's going to take some creativity, but we are prepared for that possibility because a lot of the things that we're going to have to adapt to are going to be the mobility of having specialists come to the students and not the other way around. And I think that's going to be a real paradigm shift, especially from where we came from before. But once again, when you're looking at the needs nutritionally and instructionally, it's going to have to be responsive to the situation. And I think that's definitely, it shows promise when it comes to bringing those services and instruction to the kids.
Anyone else have structural thoughts on how you're approaching a general music class?
I'll just chime in and add that I feel like our planning teams have kind of come full circle on this. Initially, our sense was, yes, a lot of specials at the elementary level would be coming to the classroom. We've sort of turned on that and are at a place now where the direct answer to Christina's question is music will be in the music room. And I think part of that is, as we've talked to our colleagues in public health, they continue to help us understand the notion of cohort groups of kids. And that if those groups, once that group of 12, 15, 18 kids is together, they're together. And it really, frankly, won't matter in terms of the room they're in, whether it's their classroom or if it's in that music room, as long as the music room is kept clean and, you know, maybe even between cohorts of kids. So it might mean that there is some cleaning that goes on both by kids and teachers so that those cohorts can switch as they move. We think that's a reasonable trade-off so that kids can be in that music space.
So there's another person, Bridget asked, is anyone considering moving your ensemble rehearsals or music classes outside when possible? Are there any plans in any of your 4 districts about using outdoors? Can you speak to that?
We just will use it as much as possible. Our teachers said September, October are good months. We have an indoor facility here that they will use at the high school level, but as much as we can get in wide open space, we will. But obviously Wisconsin and weather will change that. And so we'll see how long we can go.
Yeah, it's a ditto essentially.
Fantastic. So utilizing all space, especially that outdoors. I know that the University of Colorado study is, you know, promoting outdoors is better or best, but as Holly alluded to, that's a different answer in Arizona than it is in Wisconsin, right? In terms of how long that's really a viable option. So Karen asks, is there anyone thinking through partnership ideas with area businesses or corporations to assist? And for instance, could corporate conference room be used for small group students to use internet service and pods to remove some students from the classrooms? I'm generally curious about outside the box solutions that communities might be exploring.
I don't have an answer for you, but I will say the complicating factor in that is every time you reduce class size, you increase staff. And so there's not additional funding coming our way to help with these solutions. And that's where it gets really hard because you still have to have a human being with those kids no matter where they go.
And for us, what Holly just said is absolutely true. And even if you tried to get over that barrier, you land into some other challenges that are back to potential litigation that Ben was referencing earlier. So we have a lovely wedding venue here in town that said we could use their space. They have a ballroom that can hold 1,200 people at full capacity. We have a YMCA camp that we thought we could use. And the minute that we take kids out of their public school and put them into a private property, we introduce a whole new set of challenges that, frankly, if we could then even get over the staffing issue, we'd have to confront, and it just becomes untenable. And so we have not been able to explore that. The inverse of that is we have 2 Gateway Technical College buildings that we own. They're on our property, and we normally have them leased to Gateway Technical College full time, and we have revisited those partnerships because there are buildings. And so that does offer us a little bit of expanded room to grow, but then you get back into, is it safe to grow there given exposure, access, et cetera? So it's a complicated non-answer.
And I guess I'd say ditto to what Holly and Steve said. Add a whole nother layer to that though. We want to encourage communication with our private corporations and others that do support the school. I always encourage people to reach out and say, well, do you have resources that we could use in our buildings? Do you have equipment that we could use in our buildings? Do you have grants? Do you have other ways that could fund a lot of the things that we're trying to initiate in our buildings? We've been very blessed to have those relationships, even in a small remote part of the state, such as we are. Some of our tribal entities have given monetary and other in-kind donations to support what we're doing here at school. So regardless of some of the legal implications of sending our students out of the building, I think getting the resources from those who want to help and continuing to build those relationships is a positive step, even during this crisis.
I'll mention to our attendees that I'm through the questions that have been submitted so far, other than there was one that came in that was answered to the person who asked it around just aerosol and mitigation techniques. Are there any, besides masks, right? Are there any aerosol or related mitigation techniques that you're planning on using in your regular classrooms or your music classrooms at this point? And where are you getting information to make those decisions?
And I was the one that answered that privately. We're using the NAM study, the aerosol study that came out a few days ago, and really guiding our practice from that. But in addition, doing a study on airflow in those particular areas and trying to keep airflow moving and fresh air exchange being increased compared to where it was prior. Those are some different ways to look at it. You have to involve your facilities, buildings and grounds people to really have them look at what does HVAC look like in those areas and what possibilities are there for increasing fresh airflow.
And I will add that our buildings and grounds folks, probably throughout our districts, they are working around the clock as well. And there is some pretty clear guidance from the CDC about filtration and particles per minute. And so I don't know how comfortable I necessarily am with, you know, what we're either able to do or not do. I do know that we have changed almost every filter across the summer in our whole district, and that we are absolutely in compliant with CDC. I don't know if I said that, if that would make a music teacher any more comfortable, because you can't see it and you don't really know that it's different. And so, you know, we are aware of that, I think, at an administrative level in a way that never thought I'd have to be, but it's absolutely there. And I think that, you know, the extent to which we can compound these risk mitigation efforts, we should be able to, you know, execute hopefully with much less risk.
So we have a question that involves liability and a legal question. So I'll let you all decide who's going to take this one. Conducting classes outside have been suggested as a viable option for music and non-music classes, but does this leave school districts and staff open to liability in the event of an active shooter scenario? So now we're in this pandemic where we've done a lot to secure our school buildings, and now we're going to put children outdoors. Thoughts on that?
I guess I'd start and say, isn't it unfortunate that we have to even think about this? I mean, isn't it just, anyway, I'll just leave that one right there for everybody else to consider. But I would say no, because a lot of our plans do involve the ALICE protocol, which involves evacuating the building. So having that safe place where staff and students know to go, I think that's just going to be a part of any plans that we have to utilize outdoor spaces. We have done marching bands outside without any difficulty, even with that ALICE protocol in the back of our minds. So I guess I encourage you to talk to your administration and just be very, very clear on what their expectations are regarding something that would require ALICE protocol when you're outside with a group.
I'm going to combine the next two questions from Lindy and Terry, because I think one will work well with the other. They're asking, how are you rethinking virtual learning if and when we're put back into that scenario? So how it looked in the spring, how are you rethinking that? And for those of us who are offering parents and all a virtual option, how are you staffing the virtual teaching? So if we could just talk a little bit about what that's going to look like for those of you that will be planning that.
I can speak to two pieces of it, at least, that we're considering. One is we're having conversations around, and especially at the secondary level, about can we offer more synchronous learning rather than asynchronous if we're virtual. In my previous district in Plymouth, in the spring, staff for the most part pushed instruction out and students could access it kind of whenever fit for them within the day. So we're looking at, and now we're talking about, well, we're talking about it in Plymouth, but also in Wausau as well, about looking, can we make that more synchronous, partly to streamline it for teachers, just that I am, you know, delivering instruction and there's some students in front of me and there's some at home, but they're both accessing it. So that's part of the streamlining. And then also for students and for staff to kind of create some structure and more some boundaries to your school day, because I think that was one of the struggles of the virtual learning in the spring, is that many of us felt as if we were always at school, always on, never escaping, never taking, you know, some of those healthier breaks that you need. So those are things we're talking about here as far as making virtual better. The other thing we have is in Wausau, we have WAVE, which is a virtual school. So families may simply be opting into that virtual school as just a different way. And as a known, you know, they know they'll be virtual because it's a virtual school. And that has been 6-12, but was already planned to go K-12 this year. And we are seeing enrollments in that K-5 area, a lot of new enrollments.
Anyone else with virtual learning plans and how you might be staffing them and shifts you might make?
I would maybe just add that I don't know that we necessarily envision a change to staffing, that the reality is the kids that we're working with in person probably remain the same virtually. And I think there's questions around equitable and fair and equal, and I'm not sure that we have the capacity necessarily to address those variables. On the flip side of that, I also know that we fully intend to use some of the federal CARES Act money that we will receive to support and prop up necessary software for teachers to use. And then going back to my previous comment about attempting to have all content areas receive either the same level of support or be asked to sacrifice in similar ways. I do know that we've had some music folks discuss various different platforms that they might want to leverage that would further enhance what teaching music or experiencing music virtually could look like. And some of them, you know, as we all know, those things can be costly, and yet this might be the time to make those investments. And so we're prepared to further engage in those conversations, knowing that it's probably beyond an if and almost a when we land in that virtual world again.
So we've got 2 questions remaining. One comes from Tom. I think Ben might know this person. Tom asks us about instrumental beginners. So because they require a more interactive hands-on approach, Tom would like to know if your district is going to start beginners in instrumental music.
Is there an unset expectation that I have to answer this question? Anyway.
Oh, Ben.
Okay. Once again, and I think everybody in the panel has really spoken to the innovation and the flexibility that's required to basically move forward into this new school year, this new landscape. On a local level, I would encourage people to consider other forms of instrumental music, things that may not require sanitation, that won't be spreading, you know, I hate to say aerosols, but we've been advised against, you know, having that concern of aerosols, focusing on, I hate to say, like more general topics like theory and history, technology. I would encourage, if you have the resources, to you know, we have ukuleles, we have other instruments that do not produce aerosols that can be used to teach fundamental music concepts. And we're planning on starting beginning band, but only when it's safe to do so and we have further guidance on what those aerosols, what the air quality is going to do in terms of making it safe for everybody to learn those instruments. So I would encourage you to just reach out, explore other ways that you can kind of introduce those fundamental concepts to your students using non-wind instruments, whether it's percussion, things that can be easily sanitized, non-porous surfaces. Had a ultrasonic instrument cleaner in a previous district. I mean, that's probably not a financially realistic possibility for everybody, but just having that way to ensure that it's a safe environment for you to teach in and for your students to learn in. I think that's really important.
I think this is a good example of a question or something that I said earlier, which is that we all come from the place that business as usual, and how do we make it look like it always has? And we have to remember that at least for a year here, it is going to look really different. And so appreciate what Ben said, because that's exactly what we're going to have to do, is approach the same thing in a different way.
Well, that leads into our last question, which is a WSMA question. So this is actually coming from me. So WSMA's main 4 programs every year are the State Marching Band Championship, District and State Solo Ensemble Festival, State Honors Project, and our Student Composition Project. Of those 4 programs, the only one that already was mostly online was Student Composition Project. So WSMA has been having to think a lot about how we can be in service of schools this year. We attempted and were successful at being the only state in the United States that did a virtual solo festival this spring. We had 5,000 kids participate. We then turned around and did a virtual state honors camp, one of the only states that's attempted that so far. And now we're having to imagine and revision ourselves for next year. So when we look at like something like a virtual solo ensemble festival running all year, or Student Composition Project expanding, how might, are there ways you see us as your state music organization that provides programming to students being of help or assistance, so that we might be able to help with some of those hybrid or virtual opportunities?
You know, Laurie, I would not mind trying to take a stab at very broadly responding to that. And that is that, you know, it's been said a couple of times this afternoon about, you know, we're not going back to a pre-March of 2020 reality. Mm-hmm. And, you know, when maybe I should start with kind of the kudos to you and to WSMA for how quickly the organization adapted, how thoroughly you responded to creating things that otherwise we thought were unimaginable. I kind of watched in awe from a distance at some of that work. And so for me, it ends up being about mindset. It ends up being that we're about to embark upon a new school year, and we could either choose to look at it as perhaps the toughest year ever to be an educator, or we could say, this is the most exciting, opportunistic time we've ever had. And so I know that doesn't directly address what do we do with not being able to have marching band, or what do we continue to do about, you know, do we replicate the honors camp experience virtually? But we are stumbling upon things that perhaps we never thought was possible. And maybe this is a way to get more kids exposure to develop a love for music that can carry on for generations. We don't know. I mean, history is going to tell us that. And we're making generational decisions here. So I know that doesn't directly answer your question, Laurie. I apologize about that. But I do think it sort of addresses this idea that for music teachers who are feeling a potential a loss, like how do we really reframe that to talk about the amazing new and innovative ways that we're attempting to do things? And some, frankly, are going to be a little bit messy, and we're not going to think a whole lot of them. And others, we're going to discover things that we can't believe we weren't doing 5, 10, or 20 years ago. And so that's just kind of a mindset that I've often kind of leaned into to get through some of these kind of crazy times.
I can jump in with a more micro response, Laurie. My daughter was fortunate enough to participate in the virtual State Solo and Ensemble Festival, and also to do the virtual honors camp for choir. And in both scenarios, I have to say, as a kid who loves music, she went in sort of arms crossed, little skeptical. This is not going to be the same. And fortunately, in both scenarios, she came out so happy. She loved the feedback for solo and ensemble, but I would say even more so with honors choir. She would come out of her room just absolutely beaming after spending a couple hours really singing to herself. She was with her laptop, and but they got to do fantastic things. Her group was working with one of the composers, and I think in a typical camp, they probably would not have had a composer there with them saying, here's about, you know, how this song went. But he had said to them, hey, do you guys want to write a song? And of course, all these music kids went, yeah, we want to write a song. So they did, virtually, in a very short amount of time. And then he played with it a little bit more and sent it back to them. And we'll all get to hear those recordings in October. So I think something that WSMA can do is share these stories with other educators and maybe encourage some of the kids to share their stories at their schools or through a WSMA venue, because it's amazing to me what was accomplished in such a short amount of time. The other thing I thought of is that just talking with friends who teach at the university level, they are exploring and trying all kinds of different things with their music students. And so anything we can do to help swap ideas, not just K-12, but into post-secondary as well, I think that'd be a great way for the organization to help these creative things continue to happen.
Perfect. Well, I'm going to be bringing us to closure here soon. There's a couple of things I want to share out about Wisconsin Music Strong before we close. I do wonder, Holly, Ben, Steve, and Jennifer, did you get the letter from Wisconsin Music Strong this past week? It was a letter from a coalition that came out of organizations that signed it. It was sent to all of the administrators that were in our WSMA database.
I did read it, yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
I'm going to just speak quickly to this coalition and just ask you a quick question before we close on it. We started this coalition a couple of months ago because we saw a need going into the summer and into the fall to all be working together to provide support around the state. And so these are all the organizations that have signed on to date to the coalition statewide. We're now meeting monthly. And our real goal is just to make sure we're providing accurate, good information on the website we host, as well as become resources to your school districts and to our music educators as we try to figure out what's going on this next year. And so this team of people put together a letter to administrators asking that we just make sure well-rounded education is still a part of what's happening this year. And I think you know, you represent 4 of many administrators in our state, but it sounds like all 4 of you intend to have that well-rounded education for your students. And I want to say on behalf of all of us on this call, that is so appreciated, that the whole child is still at the center of the decisions you're making. Is there any way, just briefly, because we're going to close out just in a minute or so, but any idea you have about how this forum or this coalition could be of support to you?
I guess I would just say, you know, WSMA has done an outstanding job of being a partner in education. And I guess that's what a lot of us strive for, is to build those relationships with others who can be really strong partners in education and focus on the needs of the whole child. I would just say continue having those conversations with people who have the resources who can help us put the rubber on the road.
Thank you for that, Ben. And I would encourage you all to reach out to all of us. What we said in that letter is that we're here to help. And I think, you know, we want to help. Both, you know, solving the equipment complex challenges you might be having, curricular support for educators. Wisconsin Music Educators Association has put together a COVID statement and access to resources for teachers. So just want to make sure those who are listening, as well as our panelists, are aware. It's WSMA, of course, is, you know, really wanting to be there for you, but all of these organizations are as well. We have created a Facebook group, as well as an Instagram and Twitter for Wisconsin Music Strong, and the website that was on the slide. So we just encourage everybody who's listening to check that out, because we're daily posting updated information on that website. If you have any questions about today's forum, please contact me and let me know if there's any further questions you might have. I can pass along. We did manage to get through all of the ones that were in the Q&A, but if you have any further questions, I can certainly pass those along. And finally, I just want to thank our panelists so much for taking time with us today. This was 90 minutes of precious time I know you have this summer. So thank you, Holly, Ben, Steve, and Jennifer for being with us today.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you,
To
Laurie.
those of you attending, thank you for being here. We will be posting the recording once it's done uploading onto our WSMA YouTube page. So you'll be able to find a recording of today's conversation there. Well, with that, we'll close, and everybody have a safe and wonderful rest of your day. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. You too, Laurie.
Yep, thank you.
Thank you.